I could turn on my camera. So, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Arthur Boot. I'm with the statewide GIS program here in the Office of Planning Sustainable Development. Today this is another in our series of brown bags. We've got a special guest with us. I'll let him introduce himself in a little bit, but first, some housekeeping things. Um, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to put something in the chat or raise your hand or even unmute yourself. Just be respectful of the speaker's time and try not to interrupt in mid-sentence if you can. But please feel free to chime in at any time with your questions or comments. Secondly, we are recording this presentation, this brown bag, and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel probably in the next day or two, and I'll put a link to that in the chat in a few minutes. And then I have a couple of announcements. One is just a reminder for those of you interested, there's a Digital Government Summit coming up later in the month, September 17th. It's on Oahu. I'll put a link to that in the chat as well. And then lastly, I want to introduce Lisa Webster and welcome her to the statewide GIS program. We've had a vacancy here for about 3 years, more than 3 years. So we are so happy to have Lisa join us. And going forward, she's actually going to host these things. So I'm extremely happy for that. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Lisa and maybe introduce yourself a little bit, Lisa. Thanks.
Thanks, Arthur. I'm Lisa Webster, and I am very excited to have just joined the statewide GIS program. I was previously with the Office of Planning and Sustainable Development Coastal Zone Management program since 2013. So I'm already familiar with the program because we've been in the same office for many years. My background is in planning and GIS, and I got my master's at DERP at UH, and I've done some GIS work for CSAM program and for UH, and now I get to do it all the time, and I love it. So with that, I'm going to introduce Alan briefly, and then if I miss anything, he can add to the introduction. So today our guest speaker is going to be Alan Clinton, who is a GIS and Civic Planning professional and the Administrative Planning Officer at the County of Kauai's Planning Department, working at the nexus of long-range and regulatory planning with an emphasis on resiliency programming and administering technology solutions. Alan's academic background includes studies in geography, natural resources, and civic planning. And Alan is the chairperson for the Hawaii Commission for National and Community Service, and also sits on the board of HIGICC, and is also a member of the State Hazard Mitigation Forum. Today, Alan's going to be talking about GIS policy in the spirit of science. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alan.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lisa. Can you guys see my screen? Okay, awesome. Well, as Lisa indicated, and as we're having this discussion, and as we regularly have this conversations in sort of the planning and resiliency space, there are sort of three things that I'll plan to touch on today. One is, once again, the sea level rise constraint district, which many of you guys may already be familiar with, but I'll provide an overview of that. But more importantly, diving into the geospatial elements of that, but also how it relates to the writing of the ordinance, how the data was integrated, how we've sort of accidentally created a different policy vessel type for accommodating science into governments and law, which has been a very interesting pathway or conversation pathway that we've been engaging with. And then from there, I'll probably pivot a little bit to some of our work that we've been doing in the wildfire space and GIS for data collection to inform those different programs. And then lastly, where we're moving with some of the 3D GIS and a contract that we are about to sign following obtaining a hazard mitigation grant from the HMGP program with FEMA following the Lahaina fires. and some of the exciting spaces we'll be navigating with that project. So if that sounds good to everybody and Lisa, I'll go ahead and move forward here. Let's see if I can do this. Correct. All right. As Lisa indicated, my name is Alan Clinton. I love my title, Administrative Planning Officer, because it doesn't mean anything to anybody. And ultimately, the multiple people who I report to love that flexibility because it means that 5% of other duties for most civil servants is 100% my job. So it is fun because I get to um, go work in a variety of different spaces across the county. If you want to learn more about me, I was told that this is one of my doppelgangers from season 3 of what was that British show? Goodness, Bridgerton. Apparently, I talk and act like this individual and play a very similar role. So um, please don't refer to me in any formal way associated with this period. But anyway, I was told this is a fantastic representation of me, and suit yourself if you want to call me Sir Alfred Debling. I prefer not, though. Um, Quickly before I get started, I am currently actually on Maui at the Situation Unit Leader training for the ICS system. And just so that all of you, if you guys ever want to get your egos inflated as a GIS analyst or a specialist, come to this training. It makes you feel so valued. And apparently, I can order a GIS mapping trailer. So I think all of you guys should ask and talk to your respective emergency management administrators and request that you need a GIS trailer to do your job. So anyway, I'm gonna come back to emergency management and pretty much ask Elton for one of these. We'll see what he says, or whether or not I'm allowed to put in a resource request. So it's been a fun training over here on Maui at the Pacific Disaster Center. A lot of the Maui folks here. But another way that folks in the GIS space can get more involved in our emergency management operations, highly recommend it. But anyway, I love giving presentations. I try to make them sort of fun and um, borderline not viewable for children, just so that they're fun and engaging. Um, and what are we going to talk about? As I already mentioned before, there's sort of 3 things that I spoke to Lisa about that we can address. One is the development of the sea level rise constraint district. The second one is sort of some of our work around form-based codes and fire and the role that GIS played in that conversation. And then finally, where we're going with 3D GIS and new visualization tools that we'll hopefully be using to communicate science and integrate the science into policy. So this, I'm recycling a bit of a presentation that I gave at the Coastal GeoTools Summit. It is a NOAA conference that is held every other year. Sometimes they have a focus on sort of the humanities, and sometimes they have a focus more on technology and tools. And so this is a presentation I had put together after it'd been sort of requested to give a update on the relationship between science and the law and how we can integrate different data layers and information with mitigative actions and bake them into the regulatory program for long-range planning. And most of this is more my observations in the development pathway that we went on kind of conceptually with a variety of different stakeholders and partners before adopting the Sea Level Rise Constraint District in 2023. And the basic way I can provide a brief explanation of how it differentiated itself from existing programs, it, in a nutshell, is simply taking future-looking data instead of just historic data about the location of the ocean, sea level rise, or just ocean-related hazards, rather than just using sort of the historic data that the FEMA flood program uses. We were looking for ways to incorporate data about future sea level rise hazards into our regulatory program. There are a whole bunch of different ways that efforts have kind of evolved to do this. Those of you who are very familiar with the planning world and regulatory takings and what types of activities can violate law and constitutionality. This was sort of an effort that we were able to take the data from Dr. Chip Fletcher, his team, Tiffany Anderson, and the report that was actually commissioned by OPSD and bring those data into our regulatory program for future planning. It seems to make sense as planners that if we're predicting that the things we are permitting and approving will exist for the next 70 years, why are we only considering historic data instead of the future data? And so this was an effort by the adopted in 2023 to bring those data into our regulatory program. And something that's interesting is we still have not yet been sued on this. Sometimes it's fun to have these conversations in that context where we still do not know the court's opinion on how we have chosen to implement this. We think we have a really strong policy that will stand up to legal and court muster, but it still hasn't been challenged yet, which is a very good indication. But at the same time, we still don't necessarily know how the courts will review it or act upon it when a case is brought forward. In the planning world, it's always interesting because we oftentimes get perspectives from a whole variety of different sources who want to inform a particular program. But oftentimes, a lot of the comments or information that we receive may not contribute to creating a product at the end that is implementable or digestible to all parties involved. And so this is always one of my favorite slides to share. Is it is very challenging to sort of thread that needle, so to speak, and accommodate all interested parties to make a cohesive program and something that can sort of meets that we can pretty much successfully implement down the line. And so the main stakeholders that we were trying to accommodate in this instance sort of represent sort of the four buckets in some sense: the academic space, local government, private law, and sort of coastal engineering. Coastal engineering firms who similarly do work related to predictive sea level rise models and other hazard mapping. Um, and this is sort of where I'll start to get a bit more philosophical, but there's been a larger conversation as well between the relationship between academics, local government, how data is organized, and whether or not it can be immediately used by local governments. And so this was a really great case study of how that can be, how those resources can be leveraged. And so ultimately, these faces here are probably very familiar to many of you: Dr. Chip Fletcher, Kaina Hall, my boss, Ian Jung, who used to be a county attorney at the County of Kauai Planning Department, or sorry, at the County of Kauai in the Office of the County Attorney, and then our friends over at Sea Engineering and Chris Conger. And so this kind of goes back to the let me skip ahead here to the Hawaii Sea Level Rise Vulnerability and Adaptation Report that was published by OPSD following somebody correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I believe that was the orders. It was commissioned by OPSD, and Dr. Chip Fletcher and his team put it together. And one of the main deliverables was the sea level rise exposure area data, coastal erosion, high wave run-up, and the passive flooding models. And the big sort of thing that was most interesting to us from a regulatory planning side was this disclaimer at the beginning of the document when it was originally published, that it wasn't originally intended to be used for regulatory purposes. And then later on, the disclaimer was updated to indicate that, yes, they should be, an intent should be of these data and these models is to use them for regulatory purposes. And we began scratching our heads and trying to think about how we can do this. And when you have exposure areas that are organized as a polygon that simply say these areas will flood, that didn't immediately ring the bell that there was a way that we could take the data and implement it on a regulatory basis on a parcel by parcel level. And so what came of this is we actually had a conversation with Dr. Chip Fletcher in 2023, where my boss, Kaina, this guy right here, if you folks aren't familiar with the County of Kauai's planning department, he is currently our director, but he had asked Chip if we had the individual hazard depth for each of those different layers. And he said, yes, of course we have them. But they just weren't published on the viewer from the Pacayos viewer that was made available to the public. But of course, the depths were available. And that immediately was sort of the trigger, because from there, it became very straightforward in my boss's mind about how to write a regulatory ordinance that would take the general exposure areas and create a contour system from the depths, which we could then present and project in a map. And ultimately, we could use those depth contours to create a specific set of mitigative actions associated with elevating structures, just like we do with our FEMA flood program, but using future looking data rather than just historic data. And so the visualization here is a view of what the viewer looks like. We brought in the highway run-up elevations and the passive flooding elevations, and we actually put the coastal erosion data layer to the side because our shoreline setback ordinance really already covered that. But this is sort of where things got interesting, is in the midst of organizing this and realizing that this data, the passive flooding and highway run-up elevation data, are so complicated and granular that creating a general map wouldn't really suffice as the authoritative source of information in order to bring this into a regulatory paradigm. And so what ended up happening is this definition here was incorporated into the ordinance. And I didn't think anything of this when it was first happening and when it occurred, because I was putting together the technical elements. But the interesting thing about this is this was actually an instance where we formally codified into law a digital asset. This just was done as a intuitive step by Kauaʻi when he was writing the ordinance. And later on, I was trying to figure out how, if ever challenged, we would pretty much identify to justify that this is an appropriate use of technology that can be legally defended as a way to hold the data that is going to be utilized for regulatory purposes. And I went to Esri, I talked to some other folks, and I kept asking, like, so when other clients codify digital assets into the law, how is it received? How is it done? What's best practice? And nobody could really tell me a product, sort of a protocol or the best way to do that. And then finally, we got in touch with somebody at the Library of Congress, and they said, "Oh, we've never really seen this before. Let us know when you're done, and we'll write a story about it." So that was news to me, a moment of panic and excitement, because that meant eventually we're going to be challenged on this and have to defend it. But it's sometimes nice thinking that you're working through a new paradigm. And the thing that's most exciting about this ordinance and the way this is structured is that when the new data are available, instead of creating a new ordinance from scratch, all we would really need to do is update this definition. And so a new ordinance would simply be updating this single definition in a 8-page ordinance to then take new data from a new study and incorporate it into the law. And so it is exciting to think that there are methodologies that we can take advantage of that allow us to bring that new data into our regulatory program without necessarily starting from scratch every time, but that whenever the new data is available, we simply propose a zoning amendment reflecting what study the data came from, and then we update the viewer accordingly. So that's something that we have started to do more so by standard practice for a variety of other policies that we've been introducing, but this is the one where it really is most impactful, because those data layers that we are projecting in the visualization are actually the lay of the land as far as the law is concerned and where people have to change their building behaviors. So this is sort of an exciting update. But where do we go from there? The sea level rise constraint district sort of is in this matrix, is a projection that we require folks to elevate their structures off of. So we're not taking their land, we're not taking their property, we're just saying mitigate this hazard because of a projection in a model. We all know all models are wrong, some can be useful, and that is sort of encapsulated by the sea level rise constraint district. But then the question is, do we think we should use projections for regulatory actions that strip people of their development rights. And we don't know. We know that there are possibilities that it could be done from a regulatory standpoint. The question is, on a legal standpoint, do we believe that would stand legal muster if we were challenged on, for example, creating hydrological no-build zones based off of projections rather than historic data? So we don't know the answer to that. We haven't necessarily tried it yet. But some of the data that we now have access to, it wouldn't be hard to write the regulatory action. The question is more so, if the data is available and we incorporate it into our program, will the courts be comfortable with that, especially if we're saying maybe you can't build here anymore, rather than simply rather than just mitigate. And so this is a study. I'm flipping through some slides here, but for Wainiha on the north shore of Kauai, this is just one location where this study was done for. Of course, we need this to occur island-wide to really move forward with an ordinance, but we could absolutely create setbacks based off of flow paths. We could absolutely create these criteria. The question is just, would it stand up to legal muster if we utilize these types of predictive models in our regulatory framework? So I've already been talking for a little bit, so I'm going to switch through this section. But ultimately, we kind of came to the conclusion that in order to do this, you really do need that authoritative data, link that mitigative action to the data. It should be granular, and the spatial extent should be the entire island if we can, or your entire municipality, making sure that data is accessible and useful, and then bake in what we would call the constitutional relief valve, essentially creating a variance process or an exemption process in the case that somebody presented better science or better information to alleviate them from having to adhere to a regulation if the methodology that was proposed was of higher quality, higher fidelity. Our planning commission would have that opportunity. And then, of course, branding is the most challenging thing because, of course, you do need the political capital to move these along. So that's sort of part one of this presentation, but we've ended up creating a bunch of visualizations, and let me see if I can turn the volume off of this so I can talk over it. But we've been trying to also help communicate these data in a variety of different ways with a series of different 3D tools to help educate and help people understand the lay of the land as far as the law is concerned. And so we put this animation together in Blender to help people understand how the rules would potentially impact siting of a new structure, and the footprint, elevation, different locations, and how the waters would be accommodated in the future. And so we've been playing around with some of these tools for a while. This is sort of another one where we'll be alluding to a little bit later on, where we're trying to bring our data into a 3D format so that people can experience data and information in the way they actually live their lives. We don't live on a two-dimensional plane in a bird's eye view. We operate and live in a three-dimensional landscape. So why don't we present our data from the standpoint of our government in that manner? And so this was a basic example that we had put together, trying to help communicate what that would look like. And this is an instance where we would show the barrier or the line depicting the FEMA flood zone, as well as what our oops, did I just lose this? I did. All right, you guys able to see this? Can somebody confirm?
Yes.
Okay, great. We'll skip through. And ultimately, we try to have fun. And we made another video presentation about this with the skepticism of many of our community members about incorporating these data. But we don't need to watch this entire thing either. Just another animation that we put together to help people understand what we are working on, because ultimately we do need to package up a lot of these data into a little bit more digestible format. So we'll just skip ahead. But this is sort of at the bill signing a couple of years ago, and we are very eagerly anticipating incorporating new data as it is made available into this ordinance in the future. So I'll pause there for a moment if anybody wants to ask a question about the sea level rise constraint district, or if I can provide any clarifying information. Any questions so far?
Hello, this is Craig Clewett. I have a question.
Hey, Craig.
Hey, so I know the sea level in Hawaii is a very difficult challenge because of we don't have a sea level datum, and
Yeah.
especially on Kauai, I noticed having worked there that you guys are kind of challenged with having good benchmarks for sea level. So how are you
Yeah.
tying all this down to a sea level that can be replicated and measured because it's so difficult to actually do that?
Yeah, no, and that is completely right. And I think that's the reason why the mitigative action that we're proposing is not for the sea level rise constraint district is simply accommodating and elevating your structure rather than something more extreme, which we by all means know we would be challenged on. So it's actually not something that we are if we were, for example, doing something like our shoreline setback ordinance, which is pretty much saying you cannot build here, we would have a much higher um, we would be much more conscientious of having the most survey grade capable data possible. But realizing that that's not what we have in front of us, we paired a mitigative action that doesn't sort of trigger the same type of legal challenges. Realizing that yes, all models are wrong, some can be useful. We are certainly taking that into consideration here, where we'd love to say these areas will flood, please move away, but that's just not what we could pair with the data and its essentially with its granularity and specificity. Craig, did that answer your question?
Yeah, but so basically
Okay.
you're not setting it to like a local sea level datum.
We're pretty much taking the data directly from how it was prepared in the methodology that Chip's team had organized.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. All right. The next thing, this is sort of going to be a bit of a transition, but I wanted to incorporate this as well because it's sort of the beginning of our transition in our discussion about GIS and 3D modeling. The New Millicamp form-based code is a project that we've been working on for the last couple of years. And those of you who are not quite as familiar with the planning and zoning space, a form-based code is a paradigm in the planning world where we are reprioritizing form and character of the community over use. A lot of the programs that we deploy um, historically over the last 80 to 100 years in the United States is based on something known as Euclidean zoning, which is more use-based, where we have separated the organization of our communities based off of the use. So that could be things like residential, industrial, commercial. And that's something that we've been seeing proliferate throughout the entire country and in Hawaii as well, where for the last 80 years or so, the primary paradigm has been to separate uses to organize our communities. Form-based code is a regulatory tool that we've adopted on Kauaʻi following a lot of our long-range planning efforts, where on the South Kauai Community Plan, the West Kauai Community Plan, and the Hue, and now with the East Kauai Community Plan that we're working on, a lot of the places that our community members that they identified as being the most special are places that we haven't created more of in the last 60 to 80 years. And people are requesting, um, our community members were more so informing us that they wanted to see more of particular form and character. And the form-based code was a methodology that we identified working with Opticos Design originally as a way that we could help reorganize our regulatory code to help um, uh, communities look and feel the way that our community members were requesting. And so the New Millicamp form-based code is something that we've been working on as very specific to a former plantation community on the west side of Kauai. And it was something that was fascinating to us because none of us are architects in our planning department, but um, and so we were a little bit hesitant to dive in deep and recommendations on architectural features and a variety of other elements without that background. And so while we were beginning these processes, we went through a very heavy effort to use tools like Quick Capture, Survey 123, and a variety of other tools, GIS based, so that while we were in the process of developing new regulatory codes that more so prioritize form and character, we had reference images, we had measurements, and so we collected hundreds, if not thousands, of data points on a variety of these structures so that when we were in the process of trying to create 3D models or organize our regulatory code with a variety of different setbacks or measurements of building types and frontages, we kind of had a reference to build off of. And so we've been heavily using a variety of Esri products, particularly Quick Capture for these purposes. Some of these structures are just so incredibly remarkable. And it created a paradigm that we wanted to replicate. And there was just other features the amount of care that we saw in some of these communities of their landscapes, of their gardens, it was just truly remarkable to see. And these are things that we all identified in the midst of our data collection efforts. And we were able to bring all of these data into GIS, help us understand the lay of the land, of architectural features, different building types, and ultimately organize so that all of that data into a format that would allow us to identify trends as far as the size of structures, whether or not they had wings, if they had multiple main bodies, if they had lanais or lanais that were engaged to the structure. And from there, we could take these data and create codes. Similarly, we took all of those data, all the photos, and from that created some reference images that we could take advantage of in order to draft that code with visualizations that specifically spoke to that particular area. And so a lot of these models here were just built in SketchUp and then brought into tools like ArcGIS Urban, which is presented here. This is just another three-dimensional view of what that layout could potentially look like in a scenario, and trying to get as detailed as we can in our scenario planning process in the digital world so that we can paint a better picture for our community members and our council members as we share this information through the legislative review processes. Of course, playing around with things like the Unreal Engine and the new XR viewer that Esri has put forth. It's been exciting to play around with these tools as well. And then we get to the West Side Fire in Kamakani on Kauai in 2024. Actually, myself and every single other GIS person in our county was at the Esri conference while this happened. So we were all playing situation unit leader from the Esri, or I think the Hawaii HIGICC Tauhana at Esri in 2024 as this fire was unfolding on Kauai. The Lahaina fires had already occurred, and this was really our localized wake-up call on Kauai to the risk of fire near some of our most vulnerable communities on the west side of Kauai. And this was the burn scar that was produced from that fire, and the entire town of Kamakani over here on the left had been evacuated. This is one of the photos I show most common to people on Kauai in our presentations, because you can just see the pathway of this fire, where it burned, where it did not burn, which is oftentimes it paints a more interesting story. The role of actively managed agricultural spaces, areas that were not. The fire literally wound its way down right here before it went out between two actively managed fields. And you can literally see the boundaries of areas that were managed and unmanaged. And so this is such a powerful photo that we use to help communicate the value of actively managed agricultural land, even if it's being managed in a fallow capacity, but not allowing invasive species and grasses to just proliferate unmanaged for years and years and years adjacent to a lot of our towns. But this fire occurred while we were in the midst of trying to write these form-based codes. And so we didn't really know where to go with that at first. Kaina, my boss, sent us to a variety of conferences on wildfire management. The WUI conference we went to in Kansas City and then Reno to learn about what role the built environment plays and the wildland plays in mitigating the spread of fire, and what are the ideal remedies that we can think through and try to bring into our regulatory program. So these were all things that we ended up considering as we move forward with writing these form-based codes for our plantation communities. What are the things that we need to highlight and prioritize and bring into our regulatory program that we previously hadn't been considering? And so earlier we were talking about sea level rise and the ocean and hazards coming from the ocean. Then we are now flipping the script and evaluating what are the things that we can do and what things are within the planning department's control when it comes to managing the role that we have in mitigating fire from the built environment standpoint. And a lot of that is being consolidated around the discussion. That's not that wall of flames that we think of that's been sort of popularized through Hollywood movies, but it's truly those little embers and firebrands that can travel miles even that we need to prepare our homes to prevent from igniting structures. And so that 0 to 5 foot area is something that continually gets prioritized. We're in the midst right now of navigating through a wildland urban interface bill for the entire island that is currently going through our legislative processes. But a lot of that discussion started with our plantation camps, and our first effort to incorporate all these standards were really focused on these camp communities on the west side of Kauai. Playing around once again with those new tools from Esri, some of these visualization tools, it has been helpful for us to try to understand what that 30 feet, those 30 feet look like, the 0 feet, the 0 to 5 foot area look like, how do those intersect with each other? Do we have to separate our buildings further? Does that restrict density? So we've been playing around with these tools, trying to get a better lay of the land of the understanding of what different scenarios could look like if we were to tinker with a couple of different setback ideas and different proposals. So this has been a fun exercise down in the 3D modeling space. But I'm always very conscientious of the fact that I like to make that there is a discrepancy or a difference between 3D GIS and 3D modeling in GIS. A lot of what we're doing here is 3D modeling in GIS rather than what is kind of classically determined as 3D GIS, which is more LiDAR mapping and doing evaluation of the built environment or the natural environment with a variety of different tools, survey grade tools. This is sort of much more in the realm of 3D modeling and GIS rather than classical 3D GIS. Once again, another visualization of that 0 to 5 foot area, which we've been told from the fire science experts. Oftentimes when high winds impact built environments and there's lots of embers, it creates a 5 foot eddy around structures. And so that's why that 0 to 5 foot area is so important to have combustibles removed out of those zones. So this was just a depiction and the new 3D scene viewer that Esri produced of what that concept sort of looks like. Of course, playing around with other AR tools. Chloe was not happy that she had the model for this, but another way that we could just show using an AR tool, and this is with In-Situ, what those structures could look like in that 0 to 5 and that 0 to 30 foot areas. And this was put in the Lihue Park. So this was the culmination of the Plantation Camp Wildland Urban Interface Bill following that very substantial data collection effort and incorporating the best fire science we possibly could into that code. And this occurred last year and is really what we've been building off of for the current code that we're evaluating for the island-wide Wildland Urban Interface Bill. The last part, let me pause there. Are there any questions that I can maybe potentially answer about this section before moving on? Okay. The last section here that I just want to touch on is we're continuing to go down this theme of 3D modeling to help us 3D modeling and GIS to help us do some better planning. We have been working with OPSD and the TOD Council on a variety of projects in the Lihue Town Core area with our Civic Center. a mobility plan. And so these are just some of the 3D models that we've brought into GIS in a web scene so that we can tinker around with ideas, different scenarios, figure out parking plans, and have a contextualized framework that's dynamic so that if members of our community want to um, see a visualization that reflects what they experience more on a day-to-day basis, then we have this option. Um, Other fun things, we were able to transfer those 3D models into 3D printed assets. And so the TOD Council funded a project to evaluate housing feasibility near our civic campus. And those same 3D models were able to be used for interactive displays as well to engage our community members to evaluate those different scenarios. The last big thing I do want to highlight, and then I'll stop talking, and relieve you guys all of hearing my voice endlessly here, is our upcoming project with the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. We did apply for a GIS enhancement initiative in the 5% initiative category to really go from the sort of low fidelity 3D models that we've been using that are descriptive to very high fidelity 3D models so that we are transitioning from lower level of detail to levels of details that reflect reality. And so the models, let me back up. There is a professor at the University of Central Florida that has been working on this item for quite a while, trying to understand whether or not 3D visualizations are even useful and functional. And this particular research lab really focuses on the natural environment, co-creation of assets and visualizations and pretty much intelligence with local communities. And so I've been curious to learn from this research group, and hopefully we are in the process of working directly with them, but they are making this evaluation that you have something like Avatar, which is very visually rich, but it's completely fake. It's information poor. And then on the right of this slide, you've got um, a like uh, an FAA display at an airport, which is information rich, but it's very visually poor. And the question then becomes, if you combine visually rich displays with information rich displays, can you achieve that passive learning? Can you present the information in a way that people can learn passively as well as actively when you present them with that information and knowledge? That will really be what we're trying to study. And this was probably the most interesting thing from that research paper is they actually found when they were evaluating this AR tool that actual learning outcomes between an analog version and a digital version of the same information did not produce greater learning overall, but people felt like they learned more. And so that was an interesting distinction that I was hoping somebody could shine some light on, because the idea of these 3D tools are great, but do people actually learn better from them? Do our community members perceive more from them? And what we have understood is that the way people feel about information that they are being presented does have a huge impact on long-term retention of that information. And so we will be studying this in greater depth in this upcoming project. And this is a small example that I love sharing because these are actually, I present this with no context to people on Kauai, and they'll ask me, where is this? And that means we've reached a level of detail that I'm comfortable with, because it is just a combination of these 3D assets. The research group that we're working with, I hired them for something like $2,500 to put together some really high quality 3D models of some of our local invasive species that present themselves as fire risk. And the fact that we can go from these 15 models here to something like this is truly astounding. And so I'm quite excited about where this project will lead for ongoing education purposes, to communicate all the wildfire science in a way that is digestible and locally contextualized. But the level of detail of these assets is so remarkable. I almost got in trouble because I was scanning leaf litter through our plotters and our scanners at the planning department, but fortunately they didn't break. But this level of detail is almost even too much. And I was shocked by the fact that the feedback I could give to the team we were working with, I couldn't really give them good descriptive things to change. I could just say, this felt wrong, therefore we need to make some changes. And that is truly a remarkable step. That the best way for me to communicate feedback is about my general feelings, not something I can specifically point to. So we'll be working with this group to identify our ecoregions in a GIS standpoint and procedurally model with local, highly detailed assets, evacuation route planning, a variety of other different types of scenario outcomes that we're working through, and try to create a full digital twin that is more of a digital twin of our natural environment that we're so focused on with wildfire management, that oftentimes is left behind by a lot of the folks who study sort of urban dynamics in the fire space, but wanting to get a better gauge of how the natural environment interacts with the built environment, and apply some of those methods vice versa. So these are just some other examples, but there's so many cool tools out right now for us to do high fidelity scanning of assets. And the amount of detail that we can now get just from walking around these things with our phones is just truly amazing. And so when the hardest part then is doing foliage and plant assets. And so when you combine like this is a scan of a tree plus procedurally generated plants, it's really remarkable what results we can achieve. And so that's sort of really the goal of that grant, is to get a much better representation of our natural environment, show it in 3D, but also have that rich GIS information as a strong basis to help cue in our viewers. And so with that, I will wrap up. These are kind of extra slides that I had from some other conversation, but I will leave it there, open it up for questions, and see if there's any collaborations or things that we want to proceed with in the future.
Thanks, Alan. That was a great presentation. Are there any questions? Does anybody have anything they want to ask?
There are some chats.
Looks like those were people that had to leave early. So if there's no questions, I would like to ask you what's next? What's next? What are you going to do with the fire and the form-based code? What are you doing with the 3D modeling? How is that all going to come together?
Yeah, so that project that we're about to launch with the hazard mitigation grant proposal, it will be a 3-year long project, and we'll be kind of doing co-creation with our local community stakeholders and just helping people understand the lay of the land and communicate the science. And hopefully, as sort of the education and knowledge building occurs, we'll be able to pair that with future ordinance updates and changes in our regulatory program. Our island-wide wildland urban interface bill is in committee right now, and I think we have a meeting for that next week as well. So we'll see how that goes. The first presentation went really well. So once that's fully adopted, we will have our work cut out for us to help better communicate all these programs and tools, and that will also be really a focus of that grant as well. So,
well, these are all great examples of how to use GIS to move forward policy change and improve everybody's safety and mitigate for disaster. And so I really appreciate you sharing it. I think Kauai is usually in the lead on a lot of this stuff. And I think you're involved with a lot of these projects. So good job. Thank you. And thanks for sharing with everybody today.
yeah, absolutely. And if anybody particular is interested in those sort of the 3D asset generation, the development of that program overall, we'll be kind of putting together an informal, I don't know if it's going to be a technical advisory committee or just people who are introduced or interested in that project. We'll be doing as much as we can to share it. And of course, the more context we have from experts like everybody here, we know we can tailor and right size it to all those interested in all of the communities across Kauai, or this entire state, actually. So,
All right. Well, thank you, Alan. And with that, I'm going to end this Lunch and Learn. Thanks, everyone. See you next month.
Thanks, Alan.
Of course. See you guys. Thank you.